To welcome as a moderator of the next panel the Senior Arctic Analyst of the Wilson Center Polar Institute, Ms. Marisol Maddox. Marisol, the stage is yours, and I look forward to the also timely topic of a safe and secure Arctic. Marisol.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to see you all here today. And Petteri and Morten, you teed us up perfectly earlier in the day with pointing out that when you talk about Arctic security, it's not just the military security challenges, but the very real challenges that the Arctic and the world is facing from accelerating climate change and biodiversity loss. And so we will definitely be getting into the complexity of what it means when we're talking about Arctic security with the 4 different perspectives that we have today, which I think are all very complementary. And I'm very delighted that all of you could make it here today. So the speakers that we have today, I'll start with Samu Paukkunen, who is the acting director of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He will be followed by Isak Utsi, who is the mayor of Arjeplog, Sweden, and has just arrived, so did not hear the previous interventions, but I wanted to give that comment about what Petteri and Morten had said earlier, just so you know that the groundwork has been laid for your remarks to be well received. And then we will go to Tracy Smith, who is the Deputy Dean of the School of Arctic and Climate Security Studies for the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. And she is also currently a Brigadier General in the Air National Guard. And then we also have Peder Kirkegaard, who is a PhD student in security policy at the University of Greenland and is a former special advisor on defense and security for the government of Greenland. So I have requested that they each prepare some remarks just so that we can hear their perspective of, when we talk about a safe and secure Arctic, what does that mean from these various perspectives? And then looking forward to having a greater discussion. So Samu, I will hand it over to you for your remarks.
Thanks, Marisol. You all hear me? Good. I was actually thinking about the headline, safety and security. I thought that we should at least have a question mark behind that, if not rephrase it altogether. Because from my point of view, from hard security, from foreign policy analysts, it seems that Arctic is not safe, nor is it secure. And this is, of course, because of Russia. What choices Russia has taken, what policies it is now driving, has an effect to the Arctic. We have to look what Russia is doing. And when we are looking what Russia is doing, it becomes obvious that its policies touch upon all the bordering regions and countries. And there is a spectrum. On the other end of that spectrum is Russia, that is committing war crimes in Ukraine, trying to destroy a nation, affecting to the civilian population, destroying energy infrastructure, attacking civilians within a country. And then on the other spectrum of that is the Russian hybrid operations and activities against its other neighbors, including Finland. And from this we have already witnessed quite an interesting trend. Russia is exerting pressure also towards Finland. We have seen weaponized migration. We've seen all different kinds of hybrid activities taking place well before the large-scale invasion. And then this brings me to my question. Why is this? How come Russia is conducting its activities this way? I think there is at least a partial answer in a way how Russia sees that it has a right for spheres of influence. There is a thinking in Russia that because it is such a big country, that it has a right to exert pressure, try to achieve dominance in its neighboring countries. So, what to do in this kind of situation? I think the direction that we are going now is a right one. There was a decision made in Finland and the decision made in Sweden that we cannot continue on this track anymore. And that's why both Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership. And because of this decision, the whole geostrategic balance in the Arctic region is also going to be affected. Much has been done, but more needs to be done. And in this, I have been really glad to notice how far how far NATO has gone. Now we have updated the regional defense planning, and that also covers much of the Arctic. And this is done only because of the activities that Russia has been engaged with. This is a situation where we are. But what about next? Where we go from here? I think we still need to make sure that there is that level of deterrence against Russia that will safeguard us. This is not a time or a place for reset buttons. There isn't a big enough reset button in the world that would somehow change the situation. This is why also within NATO, but also within the Arctic countries, the Western Arctic countries, the situation needs to be clearly assessed and evaluated. How we go on about and increase the deterrence, but at the same time be aware that our own actions do not lead to a worse situation. This balancing act is a difficult one, but I think it needs to be done, especially in a situation like this. But this is all from me from the beginning.
Great, thanks so much, Samu. So I'll hand the microphone over to Isak, please.
Thank you, of course, Russia. And we are in the middle of this strategic operational area between Finland and the naval ports of Norway. And my perspective today is going to be the local and the regional one. And I would like to start off by now putting you into the context of northern Sweden and what we, people, decision makers, but also businesses, struggle with, and why this is important from a common safety perspective. My municipality, Arjeplog, is Sweden's fourth smallest one in population, but the fourth biggest one in area. And the size of Arjeplog, the municipality, is actually half the size of Belgium. This means that we are very, very sparsely populated, only 0.2 individuals per square kilometer. And for a reference for you guys, in Brussels, or in Belgium, I want to say, the population density is about 380 people per square kilometer. And in Brussels, I think it's 5,800 inhabitants per square kilometer. So if you just want to play with these numbers and apply Brussels population density to Arjeplog, we would not have 2,700 inhabitants. We would have 76 million. So it's a big area. Arjeplog, I represent a municipality with a lack of resources. In the context that we have a demography pyramid that is upside down, turned the wrong way. We have a very low unemployment rate, and it's really, really hard to recruit the right competence right now. That's a dark story, but we also have other ones, success stories. One is a story about green transition, about a city close to mine, Skellefteå, which is located by the Baltic Sea, a few hours from Arjeplog. Skellefteå is actually one of the fastest growing cities right now in Sweden. And their development right now, it's linked to the green transition and the building of Europe's largest battery factory for electric vehicles. And meanwhile, we also see huge investments in fossil-free steel production as well. And the large industries here, they have provided our regions, Sweden and the EU, with a fundamental core of economic activity. But we should also keep in mind that it is the small and middle-sized companies, enterprises, that will keep providing the local communities jobs, diversification, and the largest economic return. And it is their revenue that will help local communities to also build a strong civil defense. And I guess it can be noted that in Sweden, the defense has been reduced during recent decades. Nevertheless, in the northern parts of Sweden, the activities of the armed forces have not been phased out completely, but reduced. And today, based on the geopolitical situation, green transition, and also the pursuit of strategic autonomy for the EU, we have some new needs in the region. I mean, in addition to adapting to, and of course fighting against climate change, we also have other challenges right now linked to the security situation. One of them is being that we have a very low degree of self-sufficiency in food production. Another one is the production of electricity and also energy safety, energy security. And what do we need to keep in mind when we're building a safer Europe right now and a safer Arctic? Well, the first one I would like to tell you, it is that we need a strong, continue having a strong cohesion policy within the European Union. We need to support the diversification and keep up the long-term strategic work also in the next budget review in a few years. Second thing, we need to keep focusing on building capacity and support local Arctic communities, not least in the sparsely populated areas. 3, this one I think is very important. It is that we need to keep the Arctic on the EU agenda. We need to promote stronger cooperations between the northern parts of the EU region, but also link these cooperations to the greater Arctic area and strengthen them with the US, with Canada, with Greenland, and so on. And we need to keep developing the basis for people-to-people and business-to-business cooperation as well, to promote access, but also exchange, but also access to resources and trade. The fourth thing I think we need to do is to also have an ambitious investment policy for the Arctic to boost innovation, create jobs, increase accessibility to the areas and connectivity. And the fifth thing, sorry, it's a long list, but I'm almost done. I'm almost at the end. The fifth thing we need to do, the fifth bullet, is that we have to keep in mind the principles of dual use as well. When we, for example, invest in military mobility, we need to find synergies with the civilian use. And this is tricky, but I think it's important that we try to keep a shared planning among different actors, to some extent at least. And I also believe that if we manage to find synergies between civil and military use, it will also contribute to a strong local acceptance to some disturbances that will, of course, occur and be seen. And the last bullet is that we need to keep on investing in the basics. We need to connect these sparsely populated areas in the Arctic. We need to invest in broadband, mobile network, the competence supply, of course, and helping actors in Arctic communities to build their own capacity. Because on the face of it, for some people, it looks like we in the northernmost part of the EU have a lot of land and a lot of raw materials, which is true. But at the same time, we also have many economic and cultural sectors that do compete on almost every inch of land in our area, and it is important that we keep on having a sustainable but also holistic approach to this. So, in conclusion, this calls for a place-based policy making together with indigenous and local communities. This underlines the need of a bottom-up cohesion policy, and lastly, we need to find more arenas where we speak about regional land use conflict solving tools to be able to move forward. That's me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Isak. Tracy, over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Today I'm going to speak to you a little bit about North American Arctic security, climate change, as we've heard a little bit today, military presence in the North American Arctic, and then obviously we have to consider the indigenous population in Alaska and their contribution to Arctic security. So there is no question that the significance of the Arctic on global geopolitics, the high sensitivity for climate change, environmental security studies, the primacy of the geographic location from a distance and location and resourcing, the sea lanes opening up, obviously travel efficiency, military operations efficiency, et cetera, the dwindling sea ice, and the unique environmental fragility, and the Arctic's connection to the southern latitudes, as was spoken about earlier, a little bit about rising water levels, reduction in sea ice, acidification, all of those issues. Moving on to climate change, it was spoken a lot about today. The impacts of climate change, and as we are looking to the Arctic for resource extraction from everything from oil, gas, proteins, and critical minerals. It's going to require continued collaboration and communication with our allies and partners, and obviously our indigenous communities and our local SMEs, as we've spoken about earlier today. We must continue to balance the economic interests with the ecological concerns and the sustainable development. And investment is not just an Arctic nation investment, it is a global investment, because all of the resources within the Arctic affects the global population, not just specifically the Arctic. And obviously we've spoken about this too, it's a key challenge in the energy sector, as I believe, was it Norway or Finland? Who was speaking about the windmills earlier?
Norway.
Norway, right. Looking at alternatives from an energy perspective within the Arctic. And then from a military presence perspective, in the North American Arctic, we have the highest concentration of fifth-generation fighters. Advanced radar systems, long-range distributed radar, missile defense systems, and undersea capabilities. For improved Arctic security in the future, we must continue to pursue improvements multinationally, once again with our allies and partners, in domain awareness, communications improvements, logistics improvements, maritime operations, and integrated deterrence. All of this with consideration, collaboration, and respect with our indigenous and local populations, as I said earlier. From a North American perspective, there's been a lot of recent Arctic strategies, and specifically the DoD has released a national strategy for the Arctic region, and they are revising that strategy, and they just sent out an implementation plan that just came out last month. The national strategy for the Arctic region, its 4 focuses was advance U.S. security interests, climate change mitigation and environmental protection, economic development, and international cooperation and governance. What the implementation just emphasized recently was those enhanced partnerships with Arctic nations, especially with Canada and Alaska, which we have that through the NORAD and NORTHCOM partnership presently, and through our native communities between Alaska and Canada. And then combined exercises are very important, as well as training on cold weather operations. From a U.S. perspective, we've been in the desert for 20 years. Operating in the Arctic is like no other, and it's not something that you can fake. You can't show up in flip-flops, and whether it's the summer or the winter, you have to be able to train and operate within the Arctic. As was spoken earlier today, we can't neglect speaking about the Alaska Native population and the Arctic SMEs. The DoD, the Department of Defense, is committed to regular, meaningful, robust coordination and consultation with Alaska Native tribes, communities, and corporations. And I heard this previously, but it's very challenging, at least from a U.S. perspective. A lot of the policies are made back in D.C. from people who have never set foot in the Arctic. So really understanding from a SME and indigenous population is critically important. And I'll give an example. I don't know if you all heard about Typhoon Merbok, which affected Alaska. There were people back in D.C. who basically were saying things like, well, let's just go out there, we'll rent some cars, and we'll drive out to the communities. But anybody who knows anything about Alaska in the summer is that's even more challenging to get out to the native communities than in the winter. And commercial air, military air, all of those are challenged during crisis and whether they are available or not, let alone rental cars. That is very challenging within the summer. What I'd ask, though, is I think a challenge for all of us is that we have all these local experts and SMEs within our native and indigenous communities. How are we collecting and sharing that information as a collaborative effort? Some of this, yes, we want to go into the native communities and we want to engage and we want to understand, but we also need to find a way to be able to have these resources available for people to do research and to continue to come up with either emergency plans or responsiveness or other ways that we can collaborate and cooperate in the Arctic. A little bit about the natives within Alaska. Of the 574 nationally recognized tribes in the U.S., 40% of those, 227, are located in Alaska. And they comprise about 14 to 19% of the state population. There are about 20 native languages within Alaska, with some tribes having English as a secondary language. And I can speak from my military experience on that. From a recruiting perspective, we look at providing money to each of the states for recruiting, but there isn't a real understanding of the diverse nature within Alaska. As I said, there are a number of tribes and a number of different languages. So you have to be able to provide money and resourcing that is specific to those local communities. And I would just challenge us to continue to collaborate and cooperate as allies and partners, as this is a problem that we must go together, not singly.
And Hans-Peter, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Hans-Peter Kirkegaard. I am a former diplomat as a special advisor on defense and security policy. In September, I started my PhD on how Greenlandic politicians and civil servants navigate the changing security landscape. And I am focusing on the intelligence and the role of intelligence in this regard. In 2020, the law of the Danish intelligence services was passed in the Parliament of Greenland, enabling them to operate in Greenland. And in the same year, the Act on Center of Cybersecurity was also passed. The Arctic was first mentioned in the Danish Defense Intelligence Services threat assessment in 2009. Increasingly becoming a bigger part of the yearly threat assessments. It culminated in 2019 when the assessment started with an analysis of the Arctic. And the Center for Cybersecurity, which is under the Danish Defense Intelligence, published their first cyber threat assessment for Greenland this year. These have enabled Greenlandic politicians and public servants to participate in policy discussions on an informed basis with other allies, particularly in the Arctic. To my knowledge, none of the other state governments' classified intelligence is shared with local governments. The government of the government of Denmark, through the Ministry of Defense, has funded the creation of classified communication between Greenland, Faroe Islands, and Denmark, thus enabling the technical capability to receive classified information securely both in Nuuk and in Tórshavn. The increased U.S. attentions on the Arctic, partly driven by competition with China and partly by Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, together with the NATO enlargement, as well as the threat of climate change to the home planet, has created questions and political problems that require classified discussions as well as classified intelligence. However, the government of Greenland may be the only sub-state government that are participating with access to classified information. A key principle in the cooperation between states and indigenous people is free, prior, and informed consent. I have taken a copy from the United Nations Human Rights Office of the Commissioner. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People requires states to consult, cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institution in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. This becomes impossible if classified information does not reach indigenous peoples. Nathan Obed, president of the Inuit Debate Academy, recently told CBC News, "We are making decisions every day that are currently not as informed as they could be about threats and considerations." The ability and willingness of the Danish government's intelligence services to share classified intelligence has been a game changer in the cooperation between Greenland and Denmark. This has also mitigated the threat to the cohesion of the kingdom by foreign actors that may attempt to create a political problem that would split the governments apart. For example, in 2019, there was a fake letter sent from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Greenland to the US Senator Joe Cotton about funding for a referendum on independence. And that was clearly an effort to try to create some sort of discussion or disagreement between the two governments. The ability of Greenlandic and Danish politicians to have an honest, direct, and open discussion with the same base level of information has strengthened the cohesion of the kingdom. The threat of misinformation and disruption has thusly been mitigated. The Canadian Security Intelligence Services have identified foreign interference as a significant threat, primarily from China and Russia. Both desire access to natural resources in the Arctic. Same conclusion has been reached by the Danish intelligence services published in their yearly espionage threat assessment. Foreign malign influence and interference as a threat has been identified in general by all Arctic states' intelligence communities and publicized in their threat assessments. So there is a clear national security threat and a clear solution. free, prior, and informed consent. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Hans-Peter. So one of the topics that had come up previously was about, obviously, NATO enlargement and what that means for the Arctic and for international security. And so, of course, with Finland as our newest member and Sweden hopefully very soon to join, I think it would be really great to get your perspectives on, kind of the where that conversation is at. How is that affecting, the way that you're, thinking about different priorities? And I know, Isak, you had talked about also kind of dual use investments for military purposes that also can help to contribute to the civilian needs in the region. And so I'm wondering if there are any specific examples or any opportunities that you see there, or just other ways that the prospect of Sweden joining NATO, how that affects how you think. And Tracy, it'd be great to get your perspective too, with kind of the larger, Ted Stevens Center engagement with the Arctic nations. And what's not often talked about is that NATO enlargement also includes the fact that Greenland now has a seat within the Danish representation to NATO. And so, Hans-Peter, if you could maybe speak to that, I think that would be really, really interesting as well. So who wants to start?
I think I can start. Yeah, so the government of Greenland had a desire to have more information about the going on in NATO, because I think it was last year or the year before, NATO had the High North for the first time in their communique after a meeting. And then in the new strategic concept, the High North is also a part of it. So the government of Greenland wishes to be knowledgeable about the workings of NATO, and with the principle of we don't know what we don't know, and the trust that has been created between the two governments. The government of Greenland then appointed a seconded representative. So it is so the representative is seconded by the government of Greenland, but it is a representative of the kingdom to NATO. And there is a lot of desire to know about how is NATO dealing with the non-military threats, the climate change, the supply chain security, and questions of that nature that could be useful for the government of Greenland to learn about.
Go ahead.
Maybe a comment from the Finnish perspective. I think it was quite unprecedented how the support for NATO membership rose in Finland after the invasion, from around 20% to 80%, and it's been keeping on that level. So there is huge and wide support for NATO membership in Finland. Then about the consequences, of course, it is an ongoing process. We are just learning the ropes, but at the same time, there is a vision that this was the right direction to go. And now there's also the fallback, or the consequences, when Russia was threatening Finland during the process that there will be military technological responses for the Finnish NATO membership. And this operation has been now started by Moscow. The operation where they are exerting pressure, where the coercive action is gaining momentum, is ongoing. We've seen Russia operating on the surface, on the borders, and in the cyber realm. And this is also partly tied to Arctic in a way that, as Finland has joined and Sweden is about to join, this provides the Nordic countries the possibility to plan for the whole region, which hasn't been the case thus far. And this will have quite a significant impact on the Russian ability and capability to militarily try to suppress or blackmail the governments of the region. This is at least my reading. But at the same time, there is an ongoing discussion also in Helsinki, in other parts of Finland, what is behind this operation. And this is exactly what also Russia is aiming for. Russia is a master of only few things, but one of those is creating fear and uncertainty. And then this is what we now see in real life. But I can still report that the response from the Finnish side, especially when it comes to weaponizing migration, has been, at least thus far, a successful one. We've been able to limit the number and at the same time balance between securing national sovereignty and the rights of those who are in need of help. But this needs to be further discussed, and we will see only in the future what is the end result of this operation. Thank you.
Okay, Marisol specifically asked me about what we're doing within the Ted Stevens Center, and just to back it up a little bit, when the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, created the Ted Stevens Center, one of the challenges that he provided to us was engaging with allies and partners. And obviously the National Defense Strategy, the National Strategy for the Arctic region, you see common themes of engaging with allies and partners. So our center has 4 pillars. We have strategic engagement, we have the School of Arctic and Climate Security Studies, we have research and development, and then we have a mission support division. So under the strategic engagement division, we recently, I believe it was August, we took 7 of the Arctic nations ambassadors up to Uttiavik, and they got to see, feel, and touch the Arctic. Seeing things like coastal erosion, the challenges of energy infrastructure within the Arctic, sewer lines buried in permafrost and how those are very vulnerable versus the very expensive sewer lines underneath the ground. They went to the Barrow Arctic Research Center and heard from Native Alaskans and indigenous community on the challenges of living specifically in the Arctic. And we went out on the tundra. We went and looked at the NOAA, the National Observatory up there, where they are doing consistent tests on climate change and things like that. And so it was very collaborative. At the end of the couple days that we were there, we kind of posed some Arctic climate security dilemmas for the group to think through. And it was very beneficial to hear the similar challenges between the Arctic nations, whether it's engaging with our indigenous population or the effects of climate change or, policy and how that relates to action, things like that. So that's just one of the things that we're doing within the Ted Stevens Center. And Marisol, if you don't mind, I would, as we talk about NATO and we look at 2% for the countries involved in NATO from contributing towards defense, I would offer that maybe we should be looking at an additional percentage or so that goes towards climate change within the region as well. That could be something that NATO, as we progress and get more people involved, we can actually fund and take action versus talking about it.
Yeah, Isak.
Well, I think in our area, in the northern parts of Sweden, we have had training exercises with NATO and other allied partners for a long time, and we're used to that in a general sense, at least. And the military and the NATO have been present in many people's everyday life in different ways. And what is happening now? Well, we as municipalities, but also Swedish authorities, work as we are members in NATO already. That means that we are already planning for whatever we have to do when we become members in NATO, because we will become members, of course. But this is also, I mean, my point is from my introduction is that this is actually about strong local communities. For instance, one big thing about NATO is the host nation support, which will need a lot of local resources if we have to find ourselves in that situation. You need strong local governments, strong organizations that can help out to for instance, bring food, bring medicines, bring healthcare, and whatever is needed if that situation would appear. But it's also, I mean, today allocating a lot of resources from the local municipalities, because NATO checklists aren't too, they're very, how should we say, they're very long. And of course, we have to implement it in our local and regional planning right now. So we're already there in our minds, at least. And I also think Samu talked about weaponized immigration. Of course, the NATO membership turns the situation a bit, and we're probably seeing some kind of weaponized labor force movements right now, I would believe, in the northern parts of Sweden, in relation to the large investments in green transition, in green steel, and so on. And it's a perfect opportunity for a state well, it's a window of opportunity, so to speak. So of course we have to think about that as well.
Yeah, the expansion of hybrid threats in the Arctic is definitely very complex, and of course only expected to be kind of more so with Sweden joining, and especially because Russia has moved the Arctic to its #1 region of strategic priority. And I'd be curious if, like, for Sweden, I know with the Psychological Defense Agency, the way that maybe that work could lead to greater cooperation within NATO on kind of countering the narrative and information operations that have been shown to proliferate around elections and the perception of different issues. But I was just wondering if any of you wanted to speak any further to the issue of hybrid threats, and just obviously it's been very top of mind with Finland and Estonia with the Baltic Pipe incident recently, and of course, Samu, as you referenced, the weaponization of human beings that Russia is currently, instrumentalizing against Finland, bringing, these asylum seekers up to the Finnish Arctic border of all places, when they're completely unprepared for that, and creating a humanitarian crisis. So, if anybody has any thoughts on kind of that topic and the challenges around deterrence with that, or just any recent thoughts on that, I think would be very interesting to hear. Yeah, please, Samu.
Thanks, Marisol. Just maybe a few comments on the top of my head. I referred to Russia that they are masters of only few things, but the list might be actually a bit longer than I informed in the beginning, because they are really clever in operating between NATO and the European Union, where the deterrence gap, I think it's in its widest. That when it would be an issue of NATO, that is something that they avoid. They are operating under the threshold of war, but just below that threshold. And at the same time, when they are pressurizing individual countries, one after another, it is quite difficult also to coordinate among the European Union countries or within NATO countries. One key element is, of course, exchange of information, preparedness. How we can better prepare for these kind of nasty activities. And also to understand what's the end game. What is the end game and what they are pursuing with these activities. I think this is vital to understand behind the activities. If it's limiting to the extent that we are uplifting the deterrence in the north, then we will have to make sure that we are actually bringing in additional folders to that. If it's impacting our capability to support Ukraine, as all European countries have done, I think the real response would be there to support even more, as is our moral obligation in any case. Make sure that the EU sanctions are tighter. This would then bring expenses for those consequences and actions that Russia is engaged and by which they are trying to affect to our policies.
I just want to add on to that. You talked about governance a little bit, and I do think there's a huge gap in governance within the Arctic. And many of you mentioned, you know, the primacy of the Arctic Council, but we cannot forget, like in these acts, you know, these acts, whether they are cutting cables or, you know, dropping migrants off at the border or, all, you know, all the things that Russia does. What governance are we really referring to that can be used to be somewhat of a deterrent? Or are we still counting on a peaceful and prosperous Arctic with a nation that completely disregards that?
Yeah. There's a researcher called Mike Gagliotti, I don't know if you know him, he called it weaponization of everything. Mm-hmm. And as a kind of an example of that, when I started working as a diplomat, I was told defense and security will be a small part of your portfolio because there isn't much to do in Greenland. So you're going to do trade and cooperation with the US. But when I left my job to do this research, it was my full-time job on defense and security. And that is partly because the complexity of the hybrid threats is now moving over to areas where the security usually wasn't a question, where open and honest cooperation was the norm. But that all changed prior to the invasion of Ukraine. You know, that changed maybe around 2019 when we started realizing the ambition of China and understanding what's going on. And everyone in Greenland and in Denmark had to kind of figure out how do we navigate this.
Yep. Thank you. Isak.
Thank you. I think a bit about what Hans-Peder said about the issue with the intelligence services in your region. I think it's a coin with two sides. And one thing is that we don't talk to each other about the threats. We don't have a common planning about how to face threats. That's the one side. And as I said, the other side of this coin might be that we don't have this common discussion either about what precautions we make, what planning we make. And I think, of course, it's tricky because we shouldn't like it's a lot of this information is, of course, highly classified. But we need to try to find some intersection between these two things where we can talk about them in a way that people feel like they are a part of what is going on, because I think when people know more, it's more easy for us to resist against hybrid threats. As you said, indigenous communities or other actors in this area investing in different stuff, infrastructure or whatever, pipelines. Of course, if we have a greater knowledge and share this knowledge with each other, we will navigate easier between these islands of misinformation, disinformation, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I have just one brief question for you, and then I want to give a chance if there's anybody else wants to reflect on the panel to what you heard from another panelist. But then otherwise, we'll go to the audience for questions, so get those ready. But Isak, I'm curious because in the U.S., we have a real struggle with translating foreign policy to the domestic sphere to try to have Americans understand why these certain foreign policy engagement really matters. And so I was struck by your comments around things like, we need to have more EU Arctic cooperation, and specifically kind of the comments around the EU. Do you feel like your constituent base kind of recognizes the benefits of being a part of the EU, or that they feel like that is something that is meaningful to them beyond just technically being a member of the EU? Or do you feel like there is kind of a that is kind of lacking?
That's a really good question. But the short answer is that the support for the European Union is very high in Sweden. I think that common people, constituents, and so on, see the perks of the union. But we have a tricky situation. The elections for the EU is coming up next summer in June, and it's not that many people who vote. So in a general way, we appreciate the union. Most people do, but it's still very far away. And how to solve that? Well, that's a longer answer.
Yes, of course.
But I think one way is that we politicians, but also other decision makers, really try to talk to people about how it affects the everyday life, in the same way as we need to talk about military investments, in how it can affect your commuting to another city, or how it can enhance the transports we can do on railroads or whatever, to make it more everyday, more of an everyday topic.
Right. Yeah. It just because it's interesting to be seeing some of the recent elections in Europe, where some of the fringe parties that are getting more votes that don't necessarily support EU engagement. I mean, of course, recently with the Netherlands, and then with in Finland recently with that election, and how that ties in with some of the information operations from those who want to see a weakened West or a weakened Europe. And at a time, of course, where Europe is seeking strategic autonomy, and recently just had a multilateral defense exercise, which I think is a really great signal showing kind of the EU strengthening their united kind of defense capability that could help to protect Europe more. So it's interesting to kind of see how that seems like something that would be very much in Europe's favor, so I could see that being something that adversaries would want to weaken. So it's an interesting spot. Anybody else want to comment on anything else anybody said? Otherwise, we'll go to the audience. Okay, great. Yes. Right here.
Yeah, Jan Gunnar Winter from the Arctic University of Norway. What an excellent, depressive, and realistic panel. My question is there anybody of you seeing any light in the tunnel?
I just came from the Cold Weather Operations Conference in Norway, and it was really amazing, the collaboration and the energy of the Arctic nations and wanting to share information and, cold weather exercises, et cetera, like that. So I think there is a lot of synergy happening as well as energy towards that. We also had 3 people from Ukraine come and speak to the group, and it was very enlightening. So I think the Arctic nations and nations as a whole know that we have to do this together, and it has to be through, like we talked about, integrated deterrence and multi-domain awareness and the improved communications and sharing intelligence, things like that. And I think all that is happening today.
Great. Samu?
Thanks. I do apologize for being the doom and gloom guy.
Well, you're Finnish, so...
It's part of the role, I presume. But about positive things, I do appreciate the way that how the Western Arctic countries have come together. That's something that I regard as a good sign, that there is a in-depth understanding of the importance of the region. There is willingness to shoulder more burden, and there is an understanding of the vitality of the region. I think this has been already showcased. In the long run, I know that I shouldn't be hopeful, but if Russia comes terms to the fact that it is not a great power, if it can discover its role in a way that is more acceptable and more in line with the international rules and regulations, I think at that point we will have a chance, hopefully, for a real cooperation. But that might be hopeful thinking for next few years.
Yeah, I have a note here from when I was doing some research where I wrote down the world is dark and full of terror. So I get the point that it might be scary, but I just watched Napoleon, the movie, like last week, and Europe has been in a lot of wars for a very long time, but since World War II, mainly peace. So, and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was meant to destabilize NATO, but it showed up stronger. The unity of the European nations is stronger. So I think that is hopeful that, that the Russian aggression did not lead to a larger conflict in the EU. So I think, or in NATO, and I think that's a bright spot.
Isak, did you want to comment on that one, or we can go?
Yes. I think there is a light in the tunnel. And one of my points, one of my bullets was that we need to keep at least the Arctic on the agenda, even though we have a lot of things that stresses the systems right now with conflicts, not only, would I say, against enemy states, but also other kinds of conflicts within the European Union, for instance, which is only going to hurt our competitiveness in the long term. And I think if we can keep investing in a strong cohesion policy, and also keeping. Trying to have a plan for I mean, this is going to be a situation for a long time, as my fellow panelists have told us. But we still need to have a focus as well on there will be a day when the doors will open again, and when that day arrives, we need to be able to have these people-to-people discussions also with Russian local governments, local people, local communities. So yeah, I think it will lighten up, but it's far from over right now, and we have to do two things at the same time. Very strange answer, but yeah, it will be good.
You are a politician.
Yeah, I'm a politician.
Great. All right. Yes.
Hello. My name is Stanislav. I'm a trainee at the European Commission at the Director General for Mobility and Transport. First of all, thank you very much for the insightful discussion. I would like to ask a question on China. It's been a decade since China became an observer at the Arctic Council, and we have seen that China has been increasingly interested in the Arctic with increasing projects, and also in recent years there has been increasing strategic rapprochement with Russia, and there have been some concerns, especially since Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And maybe my question would be from a US perspective. How do you see the Chinese involvement in the Arctic? Do you mainly see China as contributing to Arctic research, or is also China increasingly becoming securitized? And I was also curious from maybe a more local perspective for the mayor in Sweden. You mentioned the need for connectivity and for large investments, and I was curious to know what kind of strategy do you have to attract investments, maybe also about if you could talk about foreign investments, and for instance, do you see any Chinese investments, and how do you view them? Thank you very much.
From the U.S. perspective, if you go back to our national defense strategy and some of our other strategic documents, China is our #1 priority, and the Indo-Pacific theater is an even higher priority. So from a resourcing defense perspective, if you look at where assets are, the Indo-Pacific theater is our #1 priority. So from China, from an Arctic perspective, believe that just like Russia, China plays a long game, and they are currently, every day putting their toe over the line to stretch the boundaries, which is why, as I said earlier, we've got to increase the governance and accountability within the Arctic, because we are beyond a peaceful and collaborative Arctic. We have to do something about it instead of admiring the problem. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. First one, foreign investments. Yes, we do have them as well. China is of course doing that as well in Sweden and also in the northern parts of Sweden. For instance, they have China-owned companies have invested in wind power plants, large-scale wind power plants. I think it's the biggest one in Europe, maybe as well. It's huge. And other strategic infrastructure as well, so it's going on. Right now, the government have or will soon have changed the laws, so it will be easier for the state to stop such investments if they are critical for local, for infrastructure or something. The other part of the question, I heard you say what should we do to cooperate more among each other within the Arctic? Was that the question? Or I mean, we have a lot of cooperations right now, and I think we need to strengthen them even more. For instance, we have the NSPA, the Northern Sparsely Populated Areas, which is a platform for the northern part of Norway, northern part of Sweden, and northern part of Finland. And our objective is to work against the EU institutions with knowledge and so on about our conditions and so on, and what we see, what kind of policy we see the need of. We have collaborations also between the Arctic universities. We have the Arctic 5, for instance, which is a cooperation on that area. And finally, how to I will go back to this question as well about foreign investments. I think it's every investment that will happen is going to happen in a municipality somewhere. And it's very important that all these municipalities that we have also have the competence, the right skills, the officials with the right skills, with the right competence, that are able to, as I said before, navigate in this new landscape that we have. And it's a really tricky part because we have this problem with finding the right competence. There aren't that many people with this profile. They are not like laying under a stone. They do have jobs, and they are over their head right now, full with jobs. So we need to do some strategic work together as well to bring out to produce more of these persons that can help us to do this.
Yeah. And I know that the EU Special Envoy had just talked about the new initiative, about the Arctic Urban and Regional Cooperation Initiative, and so I'll be curious to kind of see how that intersects with some of these, the needs that, because what you're saying is not uncommon from what you hear from many other Arctic regions, right, with needing to grow capacity and having certain expertise. So it could be an interesting space. And then just Tracy, on the China piece, I think your answer speaks to just the complexity of what we're dealing with in the Arctic, because we do have to grapple with the reality that we have a fundamentally altered security environment. But at the same time, as Petteri said earlier, that we need to also not develop an Arctic war mindset that projects conflict onto the region. And so it's interesting, and I think that NATO's approach so far towards the Arctic has represented the real nuance and sensitivity there about having certain capabilities, having effective deterrence. But not over securitizing or over militarizing. But obviously you need to have the operational capability to deter attacks and aggression. And obviously that we're just seeing more and more of that with Russia, and then Russian and Chinese cooperation, and especially when you get into the hybrid tactics or the more overt stuff, like the Russian-Chinese naval maneuvers off the coast of Alaska.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, understanding our enemy, obviously, and understanding the ends of what our enemy is trying to achieve, and those ends are not they're not of good intention. So I understand the point of not militarizing the Arctic, but the reality of not holding accountable with the enemy that we know is just going to be more transgressions, in my opinion.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Justus, and I come from a Finnish NGO called Operation Arctic. And what we do is we do policy advocacy work on Arctic sea ice preservation. And for me, it seems like the melting Arctic sea ice, it's kind of taken as a thing that is going to happen, and it's not challenged. It's accepted that the Arctic sea ice is melting. And I just wanted to ask from a security perspective that is it considered that we could look into these climate interventions to stop the melting sea ice, to keep the sea frozen in the Arctic?
Does anybody want to tackle that one?
Well, I can sort of answer it, but more maybe indirectly, because the sea ice has already begun changing and become and already melted. One of the government of Greenland's policies is to increase domain awareness, because you need it for certain rescue, because the sea ice doesn't come until much later in the year, and some years it doesn't show up at all. So that means that a lot of fishermen and hunters go out on the ocean in worse weather, and in November, December in Greenland, it gets dark like this around noon in some places, or it doesn't even get lighter. So you would need domain awareness to do certain rescue operations. So the sea ice is already, the lack of sea ice is already causing a lot of trouble.
I love the idea that when decision makers are not making progress enough, there are NGOs and there's youth that are pushing those responsible to act more. So thumbs up on being active on this. At the same time, it is also a balancing act to what we invest our capabilities and money. Climate engineering, I think it is an issue that needs to be extremely carefully assessed. There are those consequences that are not that we cannot prevent, and then there are the local solutions. I am interested personally in one of those solutions, but then if we back up a little bit, the climate change wasn't the consequence of the people that live in the Arctic that is having an impact on the Arctic. There is already a plan which we must follow, but also that plan needs to be implemented with that kind of force that provides us possibilities to stay on that 1.5, which is extremely difficult now track. But for that, we need also the climate data from guess who? It is also, again, Russia that is withholding that information that we need for the climate modeling. We've been discussing about weaponizing different issues, weaponizing everything. But we actually see that this is the case. Russia either weaponizes or blackmails with everything it can. And this is an issue that also should be of interest for China, for India. It is not, again, an Arctic-related issue. But since its consequences for the global modeling are so important, this is at least what we should demand from them.
All right, so we have come to the end of our session. That went quicker than I expected. So I guess I'll follow the pattern that has emerged, which is your 20 seconds of wrap up, and I'll just also say that yes, obviously, when you're talking about all of the security threats that we deal with in the Arctic, it can feel a little daunting and overwhelming if you just think about the threats. But I think what also emerges is just the incredible potentials for cooperation and new types of cooperation that are only just starting to emerge. And Hans-Peter, I think your research into the ways that indigenous peoples can be more tightly linked into government perceptions of security threats and how that can evolve and how there can just be greater cooperation is one of those areas that I think has a lot of potential, and that can also relate to just building stronger relationships and trying to also overcome have the healing that needs to occur from all of the traumas from history. So I think all these things are interlinked, and when you look at solutions, they're often very multifunctional and they will address different needs. And I think that's like the bright spot for me, because otherwise it's too much. But if you want to start, Hans-Peter, we can go down the line.
I was listening to an interview of Joanne Baez here recently, and she told me that hope requires work. So you have to work at it. You have to assess the threats and kind of work from them and kind of create the hope you need to kind of move forward in a more volatile world we live in right now. So.
That was wisely said. I'm a little bit envious. What I think is important that we remain intellectually honest, that we engage in open discussion. For us, it means that we evaluate the situation as we see it, as we analyze it, not the way that we would like to or hope to see that. And at the same time, this is the thing that sets us apart, the Western community, from others, from the authoritarian systems, that we can engage in discussions, that we can have a debate, that we can actually disagree, and still I won't be murdered when I leave the building. Hopefully so. This is something that I think we should underline in all our discussions. This is a resource for us to use. You don't see that in authoritarian countries.
I can't remember who we were talking to about, basically COVID showed us that we can mobilize and move to action. I just hope that it doesn't take a crisis for us to actually move to action with what we need to do as far as climate change, because I agree that it is a global problem, not an Arctic nation problem. And definitely appreciate the collaboration and discussion, but what is going to be the spark that gets us to move to action?
I think we need to keep the two thoughts at the same time. We can't move money, funding, from the long-term investments in capacity building and in fighting climate change to military investments. We need to do both, continue doing both, and we need to find that funding in every state, actually. Thank you.
Yeah. And I liked your idea, Tracy, about more of the climate funding that could potentially go to that 2% GDP for defense spending. Let's follow that thread. All right, thank you so much, everybody.